in some ways eclectic, but for me, it's all moving towards this idea of trying to understand the dynamics in the system. And it's definitely the beginning of that journey. And one of the reasons I was excited about coming here is I think all of you, with more recent training, different training, will have ideas. So I want to hear from you, basically, of how do I move forward this agenda. But I see this as my, sort of career agenda of moving towards understanding how these things change over time. And as I've talked about earlier, my emphasis is on institutions. I see them everywhere. Other scientists coming in and thinking about these systems will look at it in a different way. But for me, thinking about the institutions, which are the rules, but also include norms and shared strategies, which are basically sort of the ways that people do things in the world. Those are the things that I focus on. So I'm going to talk about sort of two big agendas I have. I also work with archaeologists, which is sort of something I never anticipated doing, but being within a school that has archaeologists, I've been working with them, but I'm not going to really highlight too much of that work. Instead, I'll look at my urbanization work, which most of that has been recently with the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, and most of it on Central Arizona, Phoenix. And then I have a kind of eclectic portfolio of collective action work, and this is really, I love trying to understand collective action, meaning how do people come together to solve problems. And so I have quite a bit of work in this realm, but in very different places. So the literature that I draw from, there's a lot, but the sort of snapshot, the institutions. So Ostrom, which you've already heard about, Gary Leibkat. So I do a lot on land, and so he's an economist that thinks a lot about tenure. And then North, who is sort of working at the same time as Ostrom, but won the Nobel a little ahead of her. I won in like 90s. Yeah, he also thought about institutions from a sort of economic perspective, and actually he was the one that pushed her to write Governing the Commons, which is sort of interesting. But so all of these sort of new institutional theorists think about how institutions structure our decision making, and that's a lot of what I draw on. And I think about, there's a lot of scholars working on local institutions and collective action. So Tom, I've drawn on his work, Mark Robel, there's a lot of political scientists and other scholars in that space. But then increasingly I'm drawing from other literatures as well. So the social-ecological systems, or now the socio-ecological technical systems, or the there's a whole bunch of different acronyms right here for this, but ecologists and social scientists working together to try to solve these problems. I draw from that literature. And then the urbanization literature. So I've been working with some of the geographers primarily in that space to think about urbanization. So for instance, I'm working on a paper right now with Karen Cito and Libby Wentz and thinking about how we think about urbanization and frameworks for that. And then maybe a little bit less so, but other relevant literatures. There's the whole resilience literature, which connects probably most closely to the SES literature. I draw some from that. And then my sort of new endeavor is working with a much broader swath of scientists and thinking about the Anthropocene. And so we're thinking about like planetary systems. And so that's very new to me, and some of you will know a lot more about that literature, and I would love to hear from you. So this it looks a little fuzzy, but okay. So this is the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, which is what Tom and I were sort of trained in at the workshop at Indiana. And the idea here is that you have an action arena where you're making decisions and forming rules, and rules are informing what you're doing, and norms that are coming in that maybe that you didn't decide upon but are coming from your sort of cultural background are influencing your decision making. But it's very much this idea that you have people making decisions, they're interacting, there's outcomes, you're thinking about what you want to happen, and that's influencing your system and bringing it back. And so this is from I think this is from a book chapter that I did with one of my graduate students. And we have some work in Chitwan in Nepal and on community forestry. And so we were unpacking this for that. And so the idea here is very much a framework, and that's in the name. So you're setting, these are the things that you need to sort of account for, right? And then you're using this framework, you're bringing in different theories and building models and evaluating and trying to understand what's going on within this. But this isn't, the framework is just setting the stage. So it's not causing, they're not explicit models you have to use. So many, many different kinds of social scientists primarily have used the frameworks in different ways with different models. So, so for instance, as I mentioned before, I'm coming from this new institutional literature, and so I'm using those models frequently. But I'm also working with geographers and other social scientists that are coming with very different perspectives in theoretical framing. So some of my work is informed by that as well. But I almost always think about the world in this way, and I start thinking, well, who's there? Who are the participants? What are the rules? What are the types of communities? All of these sorts of things are, I sort of set the stage before I get to work. So the big questions that I like to think about are, how institutions shape our environment, when do they emerge and evolve in response to environmental signals, and then the dynamics through space and time. So basically, in this, our SES model over here, I'm thinking about, okay, mostly about rules, but I do sometimes think about norms. And how are they changing? How do they influence the environment? And then what environmental signals influence change in those things? Yes?
What do you mean by environment? Is it like the psychologist means the environment, whereas like the ecologist means the environment?
So more the ecologist than the psychologist, but that I've only had the pleasure of working with psychologists a couple times, and so that's partially that. But mostly ecological signals that sort of we quote unquote objectively observe and can see what. So some of the work we're doing now is like with in Chitwan is on Macania, which is a vine that strangles trees and grasslands, and how are people perceiving that signal, and then how do they change their rules? So you have these vines coming in, strangling the trees. How are the communities, how do they think about what's happening, and like what are they perceiving? And we have ecologists like going in and doing the plots, although I think they're square in our case, and I don't remember why, although I was at those conversations. But yeah, so we have those and the transects and all that. So we have the ecological data to look at where are the species, and then we also have a lot of survey data asking what the communities think about what's happening. Yes?
Some people use the term institutions
and that would cause like people from the workshop to die.
When I referred to
Oh, yeah.
For the engineer, drive engineer, I say that. But can you
right.
make the distinction and
right.
give a definition of institutions just so people are
okay. So the institutions are the rules, the norms, and shared strategies. Organizations are groups of individuals that have organized into an entity of which there are institutions associated with that. But the common way that people use institutions is actually often to mean what we would say are organizations. And so we're not using it to mean organizations. Organizations have institutions associated with them, but that's not what we mean. So, sorry, no. Yeah, whole other language. And so I teach a class called Institutions, and my students always are like, you'll think you get it, and then you don't quite. You'll get it at the end, basically, of the semester. So it takes a while. It took me a long time. Right, so institutions are the rules, the norms, and the shared strategies. So these are the things that affect our decision making, right? So what you can and can't do. There are the incentives and disincentives to doing different things. And this is very much this coming from this literature between economics and political science. That's where that sort of nexus is. Other anthropology did inform it, so like Netting's work on households informed it, but most of the scholars are in that space of sort of economics and political science. So in contrast, sociologists often will use institutions, and they're talking about organizations, but like big ones, like the Catholic Church is typically an institution from that literature. We wouldn't say they're an institution, we would say they're an organization, but there are many institutions that both structure the Catholic Church as well as, you know, the sort of norms associated with being Catholic and different cultural traditions that affect how people make decisions. So it's very, it can get fuzzy.
So the organization is not only the grouping of individuals, but it's also the institutions that are associated with those individuals that have grouped them in.
It depends. Okay, so it would depend. Yes, but sometimes when people are talking about the organizations, they're just talking about the entity and how they're acting. Other times, what they're talking about are the rules or the norms. So sort of depends, I guess, is my answer. Yeah.
One useful way to think about it might be the thing versus the process.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so often the institutional literature really focuses on the processes that are associated with the practices, the rules, the spoken and unspoken, written and unwritten,
Right.
you know, practices, right? But then those can be attached with certain organizations
Right.
as well. So,
Right.
you know, that I found that I went through the same learning and growing pains.
Right. Yes. So the organizations are actors. So if we, you know, so and they often have these rules or norms associated with them, but the institutions affect the actors basically, and but the actors also enact, you know, so it goes back and forth. So it's yeah. So again, with the Catholic Church, depending on your time period, and not that I don't know that this is me delving into literature, I don't know. So, but you know, they had different disincentives, let's say, for certain behaviors, right? And they were acting upon. So they were organization or individuals within that organization that would, you know, excommunicate or whatever if you violated rules, right? So, or norms. So, okay, right. So I look at, again, sort of kind of both of those arrows, and then this is where I want to go, but we struggle with this. And some of this is methods, some of it is conceptual, but so in this space, often what we're doing is more of like the agent-based modeling, but this is, at least for me, this is tricky, and I would love feedback on this, and the others as well, but with these other ones, it's sometimes easier, you know, you sort of have cause effect. You're like, okay, what's the environmental signal? What's the rule change or, you know, policy change? What's the policy change? What's the effect on the environment? So some of my work, like in my dissertation, I was looking at whether or not zoning matters. Does it affect changes in urbanization and peri-urbanization processes? So it's sort of, you know, you have a change here. What's the change here, right? So, but this, when we're thinking about it over time and through time, I need help there. So urbanization, and I don't even know if urbanization is the right word here. A lot of my work is on urbanization, but it's urban systems as well as peri-urban. So a lot of my work also looks at places that are beginning to urbanize but are on the fringe. And I have very, very new work that I'll briefly touch on that's looking at fracking in rural places in Appalachia. So that's not, they're not exactly urbanizing, but most of my work has been on urbanization. So again, like I look at land use, water, urban policy. How does the policy affect land use decision making? So I have, you know, I don't want to say it's mundane, but it's like, okay, what's the zoning change? What's the change on the parcel? You know, how does this affect? And then, so the EJ, environmental justice people, I've had the pleasure of working with geographers that do that kind of work, like Chris Boone and Bob Bolin, and so I'm increasingly aware of needing to think about this. Not that I didn't before, but it just wasn't a part of sort of my training. I mean, justice is something that we had talked about, but how we operationalize it, how we think about it, I didn't have the kind of right language or tools, I would say. But in working with some of the geographers, I've brought in more of the structure and the power ideas, and I'm still learning a lot in that space. But we've done work in this realm, thinking about over time, how are certain groups or neighborhoods advantaged or disadvantaged? And then, you know, ultimately, we're beginning to think about what does that mean for the trajectory? Like, where are we going? And this is, again, a space that I'm moving into, but the design realm of, like, how do we make choices for a future? And so we have some people at ASU that think about scenarios, and I heard a few of you talking about that as well, which is a new realm for me, and thinking, like, forward thinking. You know, as a scientist, I was very much for what's the data, but this idea of designing is a new realm for me. Okay, so this is our CAP Central Arizona Phoenix version of that. So maybe some of the key differences, I would say, is the infrastructure, which we mean both. So we have gray, social, hybrid. So we mean in terms of the engineering as well as these more kind of social infrastructure, which includes the rules. So I was kind of like that idea. And the other big thing is we just sort of said, okay, over time these things evolve; they're not static. But I put this up here not to walk through it all, but just to sort of say, and many of you have seen many different flavors of these SES diagrams, but here's one we fought over for months and months and months, and I kind of like it, but honestly, it sort of sets the stage, and then we dive in, and we end up not necessarily using it for analysis. So that's one thing I would be curious to see how many folks actually use their conceptual diagram, to do analysis. I don't know if we do, but it did. This infrastructure was new at least for me. And it allowed us to bring in more engineers, which I think is good. Okay, so here's some work. So Phoenix, many of you are familiar with, but some of you are not, has grown tremendously over time. We keep like going back and forth, but I think we're currently the 6th largest city in the US. We were 5th for a while, but so we were very small. It was actually started as a farming community that served some military and mining outposts in the west. And then it grew fairly rapidly, but the big boom was in the post-war period. And so during that period, there had been a lot of people based in the area around World War II. They liked it, and then there were lots of boosters that really promoted it. The boosters prior to then had also really fought to establish our water rights. So we have it's very contentious in the West. We have a lot of Colorado River water. And so it enabled this, tremendous expansion. And so we've done a lot of work thinking about how that has changed over time, what changes the patterns, and we've done some work on the booms and the busts. And so I had a team, we were using Sanborn maps, which, how many of you are familiar with? I know Dexter is. So okay, and you guys have used them in different cities, or?
Like 4,000 of them.
Oh, okay. Lovely. You'll have some thoughts. Yeah, so we had trouble because wherever the repository is, had burned down, and so they were missing certain year. So these are.
It's funny because they're fire insurance.
Exactly, I know. It's sort of ironic. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So these are fire insurance maps that were used by the banking industry for mortgage purpose, and they go back. I actually don't know how far.
18. The company's still around today.
1870. Yeah. So. Yeah. So and they I actually don't have any of the actual maps. But they show like which areas are higher or lower risk, and they were used by the banking industry basically to redline. And so certain communities, it was much easier to get a mortgage than others. And so we used those to get land use information, and then we determined, using some criteria of where the nuisances were, and then looked at different populations. And unsurprisingly, we found quite a lot of overlap between nuisances and communities of color. We had some data about pre-zoning and then post. So Phoenix, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the American zoning, but it's the most common land use institution in the country, and it's typically the county or the city, what you can and can't do on your land. And in the 1920s, there was a big push to get comprehensive planning in cities and zoning. And so Phoenix sort of took on this charge as a very young city. And so we have some of our land use information is from before zoning and some after. And so we sort of looked at, did that affect what was going on in terms of, did we have less of a conflict between the nuisances and no. The moral of the story is no, it actually sort of just reinforced the process. And so this is where, in working with some of the geographers, it allowed us to sort of think through these kind of big picture power ideas of, so you have this new institutions coming in that basically say, and particularly at that time, what was called Euclidean zoning after the Supreme Court case in Euclid, Ohio, was that you want separation of housing, single-family housing, from other noxious uses, of which multifamily housing is considered one, but also particularly other things like industry. So you want separation of single-family housing from these other things. And basically what happened was that areas that were predominantly white, that had been preserved as white by racially restrictive covenants, which were then unconstitutional, so that was no longer sort of operational. Zoning just reinforced that process. And so you have continued nuisance development basically in communities of color. And also another piece, which we haven't actually put together, we went through and looked at the census data that gives you actual household data. And you see actually areas that were sort of mixed in terms of white and communities of color actually become increasingly just communities of color through this process. And part of that is, an ability to get mortgages and move out, and other things are happening at the same time. But basically, it just reinforced what was already there, which was these communities of color. That's where the nuisances are. So there's a lot of path dependence. You have the railroad there. The river is just a little bit south of here. It floods there, and that's where our poorest, most vulnerable populations are, and still are today. So here's like some of the detail. This is digitized, but of what these maps show. I mean, they're amazing. Those of you have seen them. They're so neat. There's so much richness in the data, though. It's like a question of how you deal with it, basically. So then another aspect of Phoenix, again, is water, right? So we have a lot of agriculture in Phoenix, which honestly I was surprised about. I'm from the US, but I'm from the Midwest originally, actually from Wisconsin. My family, grandparents, uncles all have dairy farms, and I should have known this, but I was shocked by the amount of dairy that is in Phoenix. I mean, one, because cows do not like heat, and it's hot. And it's huge. I mean, obviously, you're producing milk. It takes a ton of water, and then the alfalfa and the crops that sustain the cows are also very water intensive. But so there's actually a lot of agriculture in Phoenix. It's mostly large. There's still family farms, but there are these large corporations that are family-run corporations. There's a ton of cotton, and so another very water-intensive crop. So we have some projects looking at agriculture and Phoenix and thinking about that transition. So a lot, up until the mid-90s, most of the urbanization happened on former agricultural land. After that, there are a number of institutional changes, as well as sort of real physical changes in terms of getting access to our Colorado River water allocation that enabled more desert conversion. So prior to the 1990s, almost all the urbanization that occurred was on farmland. Now it's actually a much more mixed bag. So you have a lot of desert conversion. But so we're thinking about what are the sort of vulnerabilities associated with having agricultural, is also with, if we get rid of it, what does that mean as well? So we've been surveying farmers and then thinking about where agriculture is, what are, again, we have these very water intensive crops, what does that mean? And so one of the things this is a different variant of the institutional analysis and development framework that incorporates some of these other ideas. So this idea of having discourses or narratives, that's a very sort of new thing, at least for new institutional scholars. So you have basically the idea with discourse is that you have different ways of talking and thinking about what's going on, and that may influence your action arena. And I can tell you, particularly with agricultural context, as well as a lot of the collaborative environmental management I've studied, this is very much true. Like how people talk about the problem matters. You can have people in conflict, but once they find a thread that they can sort of rally around, they may come together. And so this is, again, this is just a different conceptual, or different variant of the same conceptual framework that incorporates some other theories and ideas into this. And this was, I want to say this was in International Journal of the Commons, which is a kind of an interesting journal that has a lot of new institutional work.
When you say outcomes, so it should be social, economic, or environmental?
Any of those. And often the criteria won't encompass, it never will probably encompass all of the outcomes, but frequently there's certain outcomes we may care about more. So you could have big changes in one thing, but if we don't care about it, it may not change anything that's happening. So, yes. So this is, again, another very different, very sort of Rinku, I'm sure, will recognize. So this is Hallie Eakin and her work with Tompkins. Hallie and I have that project with farmers in Maricopa County in Arizona. And so this is these ideas of whether or not you perceive a signal and whether that will lead to change. And so we've been incorporating this into thinking about whether or not farmers would change their behavior for, this is coming out of their work, this public adaptation good. So this sort of capacity to be able to adapt to change. And so in our case, we're thinking about climate change and drought in Arizona and probably less water allocation from water from the Colorado and what that would mean for agriculture and so whether or not farmers are perceiving what's going on and whether they'll change their behavior and what that would mean both for agriculture but for this larger system that includes both urban and agriculture. And what I will say from this is that if you sort of walk through this, most of the farmers do perceive change, although climate change, the phrase, is still, you can't say that because it's been sort of politicized in this context. So, but if you say drought or if you say changes in weather or yes, everyone we work with says that it's changing. You just can't say climate change. But their sensitivity to the signal, and I'll walk through some of the institutions, most of them aren't that sensitive to it because we've built in all these buffers to make sure that they're not vulnerable. So there's not a lot happening that would force them to change at the moment. Later on it may. Their motivation to act, when you talk to them, they say that they would, but again, at the moment they don't really need to. And the farmers will say they don't necessarily have any incentives to act, so why would they? Which is, again, coming from this sort of economic or new institutional perspective. If you have no incentive to change your behavior, why would you do that? And so then, these become less relevant at the time. But this idea which I think, again, it's complementary to what I was trained in, but it's a different way of thinking about it, this idea of perception, this sort of something I hadn't focused on before. So in thinking about, these larger themes of interdisciplinary or team science, I get very excited in these contexts because I learn a ton, and I think it improves some of our findings, and in particular, if we want to make an impact in the world, we need to better understand how people are perceiving things, and just looking at policy outcome isn't sufficient. So I'll just won't get into too much detail on these, but so there are all of these the water world, the legal water world in the West is crazy as a Midwesterner. It's so complicated, and this isn't even getting at the sort of water rights adjudication issues of, in the courts. This is just, so Arizona in 1980, in order to get funding for the Central Arizona project, which brings our Colorado River water to Phoenix, agreed to have Groundwater Management Act, which is considered to be one of the best in the West in terms of water management. But within it, there are all of these different kind of sub-pieces to it. And so for agriculture in Maricopa, we focused on a number of different institutions. So one thing that's quite interesting is that once Colorado River water came into the system, everyone sort of just assumed that farmers would shift onto the Colorado River water and not pump groundwater. They didn't. Why not? Because it was more expensive. Like, why would they, again, incentives, So why would they make that choice? So what ended up happening, because there are a lot of subsidence issues, was that the cities came together and subsidized the water. They decreased the price for farmers, and so farmers were able to get cheaper Colorado River water. So they shifted from pumping groundwater to using Colorado River water. So in terms of not pumping groundwater, it was good, and then the full use of Colorado River water. In this case, it's good. So this is where you have to sort of flip, and I still have mixed feelings about this. But in terms of Arizona, they saw that as a very good thing because they're always very worried that California is going to take all of their water if they don't use it. With the history of prior appropriation using the water in the West is very deep, and so if Arizona is not using the water, they're afraid California will take it. So in the sort of mind of Arizona, it was good that they were using more Colorado River water, right? So they shifted off groundwater. They're using more Colorado River water. So then you have this base program for agriculturalists. So everyone that's using water for agriculture in this designated area around Phoenix was given a certain amount of water that they could use that was based on historic use. And so we have minimal changes in this program. They created this, if farmers didn't use their full allocation, they were given what were called flex credits, which they then could use in another year if they added a third crop to the rotation or whatever. So basically that program had minimal effect in changing any kind of groundwater or Colorado River use. It sort of was status quo. But then they instituted this best management program, which sounds good, right? These are the latest and greatest techniques in farming. Well, in actuality, anyone that enrolled in that program only did so because they needed more water than they would have had with the status quo. So it actually had a negative effect in terms of more people were pumping groundwater. It had a positive effect, again, in this weird world in that they're using more Colorado River water. So anyway, so we went through and thought about the institutions and what the effects were. Now, coming here, we haven't really thought through a lot of, we didn't have any hydrologists on the team. We didn't have any, so we haven't thought through this larger systemic piece. But we were just thinking about how do these institutions affect farmers, and then these sort of aggregate, what does it do for water use? But in thinking much longer term and with climate change, we need to be thinking about the entire system. And so you guys definitely could help us think through some of that. And so again, here, we have, we anticipate much less water from the Colorado in the future. How much? We don't know. What does that mean? We don't know yet. But most likely, if we don't get our full Colorado allocation, it's going to mean big, big changes. And within Arizona, the farmers will be the first ones that are hit because they have they're the lowest priority use in Arizona. And then just another thing to bring in, and I'm sure Tom will probably talk about this a little bit, is one of the things that we were, I don't know, ingrained, our training is always to think about multiple levels, this idea of polycentricity, so you have multiple layers of sort of governance occurring. And so within the water world, it was really interesting to me that a lot of people weren't really thinking about this. They would focus on one. This happens a lot. They focus on one level. So what's the state policy, or what is this active management policy? Or, very few people were thinking too much about irrigation districts, and we actually have hundreds of them in the state, and they all have different policies and ways of doing things. And so this is, again, we haven't done any sort of real work about this, but this is more conceptual, that we need to think about what's happening in terms of the kind of polycentricity, and then as well as this sort of this objective reality of the world, what actually is happening with the river basins and what's happening with the underlying hydrology and ecology. Okay, I'm just going to skip this. Okay, so one of the sort of take-home pieces with this, and we actually talked a lot with water managers, and this idea of going out and having science that has an impact. We had a bunch of workshops, and I'm not sure how much effect we had, but we talked to them a lot about the sort of standard practices and what we had observed with what was going on, but also this idea that, again, thinking about new narratives, new discourses of, what could be a multifunctional agriculture, an agriculture that's not just producing cotton and dairy, and alfalfa, but something that does things like, heat island mitigation. And maybe this would be a different kind of agriculture, or maybe it's the same kind of agriculture, but just different patterns. Like maybe the farm should be in different locations. And so this is an ongoing conversation that we're having right now, but I think it's an important one. Again, scientists like you that are thinking in this systemic way can help have these more, I think, interesting conversations. Again, it's not just, we up the price of water, but rather, what do we actually want? How do we govern? What are the outcomes we want to evaluate on? What does that mean? So this is another sort of related project that brings together my work on agriculture and urbanization. This was with a geography PhD student. So we used NLCD, which I know all of the geographers, well, maybe not all, but many of the geographers hate, right? But we in Phoenix have been, okay, so this is national land cover data that has been classified, and so there's lots of problems with it, right? And within places that have trees, there's tons of problems. So the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, Elena Irwin, and I forget who else, have demonstrated it does terrible in Baltimore, right? Or in places that have trees. It does okay in Phoenix, though. We have some papers that show it's actually okay because we don't have a lot of trees. So this data set it works for us. So anyway, we use that and then housing completion data to look at where houses were going up on former agricultural land. And I was actually surprised that the agricultural land rents, so what farmers were getting, mattered. I mean, and now it sounds silly to say that, but we often talk about agriculture, you don't get a lot from the land. Housing is you get so much more when you develop for housing, but actually we still need to consider what's going on in the agricultural system. Even in Phoenix, where we have this crazy housing market and huge developments, it still matters. So we need to think about the whole system. So we kind of looked at where housing development was happening, and you can see places where it's not happening as much as in other places. And we found some interesting things that hint at endogeneity, where places were annexed sort of anticipation of housing development occurring, which we know happens, but we have hints of that, but we need to actually better model that. Actually, is Nick still here? oh, sorry. Yeah, so within this, so the policy decision to annex, so you have land that's unincorporated outside of a city, and then you're going to bring it into the city. Within the economic development literature and the land use sort of urbanization literature, there's a lot of debate about what comes first, the sort of chicken and egg. Do you annex and then it develops, or does it develop and then you annex? And it often depends. But in this case, we found that most likely there's sort of anticipation of housing development. So you annex and then it develops. But it's just hinted at that. We didn't actually explicitly study that. So sort of to summarize a lot of what we've been doing, institutions matter, yay. But there's also a lot going on with socio-demographics and these larger structural processes where, again, it doesn't really matter which institutions, like in the case of zoning, you had this process where communities of color and people that were vulnerable were near toxic industrial sites, and zoning came in, it didn't protect them. It sort of perpetuated what was happening. You have land conversions driven by land rents, and a lot of path dependence, so a lot of legacies and needing to think longer term, which is, again, if we think about all this work in a sort of collective, we're getting at that, but I do think we need to better model those processes, and again, I would love help on that. So this is sort of some of Phoenix and just thinking about how quickly it has all changed. I mean, it's a very, very new city. Okay, so this is terrible. This is a late screenshot. So my new work in this kind of land space and thinking about policies and land is in this fracking realm. And so we've decided to focus, I'm working with Gwen Arnold, who's another IU graduate, but she's at UC Davis, also works sort of in this interdisciplinary space. We're going to be looking at approximately 55 counties that are in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania that have over the past decade or so been fracked. And so we're going to look at how communities are dealing with that. But particularly, I think the interesting thing, again, in thinking about kind of an SES framework, I will say we are maybe not ignoring, but we're not really going to delve into the ecological, but we're thinking about the dynamics over time and whether or not communities were able to monopolize on some of that revenue and change what they're doing, diversify. So most of the fracking work, and I would say this sort of fracking narrative, has been like, how do we keep it out, or how, what are the policies? We want to better understand in these very impoverished places, have they been able to leverage it to change? Or like, what characteristics influence that? We're just starting. So, but our plan is to look at social networks and see how policies flow through these communities, and see what the characteristics are of the places that may try to extract more rent from these. I mean, these, again, very impoverished places. My experience studying some of these places in the US, they are just desperate for any development, right? So they're so excited when fracking comes in, so excited. They're like, we have nothing. Now people have some jobs, even if it's temporary. But we want to know, what about the places that are able to sort of force some of the companies to pay for the negative impact, so they destroy the roads, there's water implications, all sorts of things, as well as, how do they then bring that back in to change their local economy. And so, like, this is one of the places we're probably going to look, which is Carroll County in Ohio, which was the sort of epicenter in Ohio. And just as sort of an aside, my sister actually lives there. And so I had been interested in this, and then I went there while this was going on. I was like, this is crazy. And then I was talking to Gwen, who had been working in fracking, and then we decided to do this. But and then, so there's interesting issues, again, associated with water. You need a lot of water to do fracking, and it's not well understood what all the implications are. So we're not going to be doing the actual sort of water ecological kinds of work, but we're interested in the policies that they put in place to try to deal with some of these. And there's, again, a lot of diversity in these different places, and a lot of interesting questions, too, about state, again, the polycentricity. So the states have very different policies, The counties, the communities have different policies. And West Virginia, who we're not sure, again, we haven't done the field work yet, but on paper looks better than Pennsylvania and Ohio, partially because they have this long, long history of resource extraction and have sort of been screwed over by the coal industry, and so have put in place a lot of laws that ostensibly protect communities. Whether or not they actually do on the ground, I don't know. But in contrast, Ohio, although this area of Ohio has had coal, has had oil, has had a lot of things, as a whole, Ohio does not have the same kind of history of resource extraction. It didn't have the same kind of state policies in place when fracking really began in earnest about a decade ago. And so they were just kind of on their back heel and trying to figure out what was going on. Additionally, these are very rural places, and this part of Ohio has very limited political power, and almost all of the revenue generated from this went to the state and stayed at the state and didn't come back to the communities. So kind of moving on to collective action, so how do people come together to deal with some of these problems? So I have some work down on the border, US-Mexico border, thinking about collaboration in this space. I will say again, your research kind of gets away from you sometimes. Like you go and you think you have this great idea of how research is going to go, and then it does not go that way. And this, I will definitely say in this case, we went down to southern Arizona because we knew there are tons and tons of collaborative groups that were really well known, and like, oh, this will be exciting to think about that. Obviously, I realized that Arizona is on the border with Mexico, but I didn't realize how much the actual discussions about the border wall, border fence would kind of overshadow what we were doing. And so when we got down there, everything was about the border. Like we couldn't talk about collaborative adaptive management, collaborative environmental management, or anything without talking about the border. So it ended up, we did a fair amount of work on the border and the border fence wall. Now, of course, as everyone knows, that's come back a bit. So we need to get back down there and talk to people again. But so there's the sort of ecological issues associated with actually building these things. It was fascinating being down there and talking with the ranchers that are from the area, many of whom have long histories of going back and forth across the border. Many of them have land across the border, and like these walls and fences are ridiculous on many accounts. But I mean, you go there, and some of this area is mountainous, and so with Bush, I forget what the grade was, but there was a certain slope that they would stop building. So they would build these things, and then you'd get to this really hilly part, and there's nothing, and then you keep going, and then there's another fence that starts, and it's just, it's absurd. So anyway, so we were looking at all of these we were looking at this ecological area known as the Sky Islands, which have any of you heard of or been to? Okay, so, I mean, amazing. Ecologically, just amazing place. So there are these isolated small mountain ranges that have, just amazing ecologies and species that are just unique to particular ranges, and they're really important ecologically, as the social scientist is trying to talk about that. But so, and then you have all these different collaborative groups organized around different kinds of things, and so you have some associated with ranching. There's a lot associated with the jaguar that has been seen there, many water ones. So the San Pedro is a very important river. Groups that organize around that and around fire. And there's all these sort of firescapes that are collaborative. And so we were trying to understand when these organize, why they organize, how they organize, and then how they're related to one another. So in this, and we focused on this one place and tried to understand what was happening. And so interestingly enough, like the ranching, again, going back to this idea that you need narratives that people can share. In the 1980s, 1990s, it was extremely contentious. Well, 1970s, the sagebrush rebellion. You have fights between ranchers and the Forest Service and BLM. We're seeing that again now in the past 5 years or so. But in this particular place, ranchers and Forest Service officials talked about a number of meetings where ranchers and federal officials got into physical altercations in the 90s. And so basically, yeah, that, and then the environmentalists, most of them were coming in. There was a big push to get cattle off the land, a series of court cases, and finally, you had the Nature Conservancy, and particularly a couple individuals that were able to sort of rally everyone together and say, okay, what we need to be worried about actually is this sort of peri-urbanization process and this loss, this fragmentation of this open space. And so they were able to rally around that. There are still people who disagree with that. So there's some environmental groups that are out and think that this is not the way to go. But once that happened, so this sort of collaboration with the ranchers and some of the federal agencies and the Nature Conservancy, all of a sudden you have all of these other groups that start spinning off and different kind of missions of these. And we ended up with there are 30, and this was now 7 or 8 years ago, 30 different collaborative groups in this one county, all dealing with different kinds of issues, and something like 100 different partners. Yes?
Just a clarification.
Yeah.
You're on the U.S. side.
We're on the U.S. side, right. And many of, what, sorry?
Malpai.
Yeah, that's Malpai, yeah. And then the Upper San Pedro Partnership, then you have all of the different firescapes and yes, many, yeah. But the Malpai were that's the early one I was, talking about. And there's some great histories of that group as well. But there are a number, I know of at least 5 that cross into Mexico, but we didn't, for a number of reasons, do that. At the time there was, well, one, on a practical matter, I don't have the language ability, and 2, it was not, there was more violence happening there at the time, and so ASU didn't want us to do work in Mexico, basically. So I think now we could, but we didn't at the time. But so we also looked at another, so this is in Central Arizona, another collaborative management. This was with a master's student in thinking about how do groups come together. Very, very different flavor. This was much more about interagency cooperation, which was fascinating. And so I'm sure Maureen has lots of opinions about the cultures of the BLM and the Forest Service and how they do or do not fit well together. And then Arizona Game and Fish has its own interesting culture. And so they were trying to work together to manage this kind of iconic allotment that's important culturally. There's a lot of archaeological sites there as well as ecologically. And so they were bringing in all different kinds of partners to manage this one allotment. Now, this is interesting to me in that it's much more about interagency collaboration versus the other one, which had some agency, but also had a lot more private partners. Here, you just have one rancher. You have a lot of interested citizens that were engaged, but it was a very different process. And so in this one, we did a lot of meetings. My master's student worked with they brought in an outside facilitator who was helping with the process. And so it was interesting in contrast to what I was just presenting in Southern Arizona, where it wasn't this structured facilitation, like we're going to collaborate. They came in and said, we want to collaborate. And it was a very, very different process. But so again, though, the narratives really mattered. They did this exercise of like the history of the place, and people did their own timelines, and then they worked together to bring them together and just to establish like what do we want out of this partnership. And so that's one type of kind of collective action and collaboration. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I also work in Chitwan, Nepal, on community forestry. And there you have these buffer forests around a national park that's iconic because it has the one-horned rhino, it has the tiger. It's one of the jewels of Nepal. And in the 90s, Nepal was at the sort of forefront of establishing, and actually Lynn was involved in some of the institutional design associated with the creation of some of these forests were user groups who forever, for a very long time, had been using the forest. But the national park was created. It was illegal to use the forest. They still use the forest. So what they ended up doing was creating these buffer zone forests that the communities would manage themselves, but the idea was essentially to get them not to collect from the park and to just use the buffer zone. So we were studying 21 community forests in this area and how they're dealing with this fast-growing vine that was sort of destroying the forest. And yeah, what did we find? Well, oh, there's some of the pretty pictures. Here's the vine. It's sort of like kudzu. It just like covers trees and like destroys them and covers the grasses and destroys them. And so we focused a lot of attention on some equity considerations. I would say this is one, and I don't know what Tom thinks about this. We have this idea of attributes in the community that has been a part of IED since, I don't know, ever since I've seen, old manuscripts with it. But often people don't actually unpack what's going on in there. So we've been trying to think about equity, who gets what, who's involved in decision making. And I'm now realizing I'm horrible with time. I'm like way over time. So should I just, let me see if I have any good points. Okay, so my last little bit. So collective action, most of my work has been at relatively small scale. So thinking about regions. I'm beginning to work with some folks at ASU, and because ASU cannot just think like small at all. We think like we're going to take over the world or the galaxy or something. I don't know.
I guess I'm now paying attention to time versus being transferred the
Yes.
presentation. I wonder though that maybe we should stop here so that people can ask questions.
Yes.
So they better understand. Maybe we take time doing that now.
Yes, please
And
do.
I'm going to leave it to you to call upon people.
Yes, I can do that. No questions.
We're going to, I think, stop with this slide and then
Yes.
for people to ask questions about
Whatever.
presentation and institution.
Yeah.
So I'm swimming through this as someone who's never seen any of this material.
Right.
So lots of really cool things and lots of things to be excited about. Could you maybe give us an example of like a method you utilize?
I will use any method I can, but I'm trained only in some of them.
But like, I guess like.
Okay, so I'll tell.
No,
Okay,
like a
so I
concrete-
use like econometric. I use a lot of econometric methods, and then I also do a lot of field work and do sort of content analysis of interview data. I do network analysis. But then I like to work with people that use other methods I don't really fully understand. So agent-based modeling and things like that to understand system dynamics.
Okay.
But yeah, but I really like if I can, I'll use any method. I don't. And that was part of my training, actually, and probably yours too. Like we were trained, you use the tool that's appropriate for the question, and so I got a little bit of training or some training in methods for social scientists, decent training in methods, but now many of you are way better trained than me. So yeah.
So when you're looking at the institutional dynamics of the dairy farmers in Arizona, because I
Right.
agree that's where it was held at the dairy farmers.
It
in
was,
Arizona.
yes,
Being,
it still
being
is.
from the Midwest as well.
Right.
What is what's an example of a question and how you would answer that there?
So one of the questions with that was, so we were interested, we had this lovely design that fell apart, but we had this whole thing about, in some places they have access to these flex credits and others they don't. We thought that the farmers that had access to the flex credits would behave differently than those that don't, because it built in this sort of buffer and years of, that they needed more water, they would be able to have more water. If we ended up finding that that wasn't the case. So how did we unpack that? Well, we had archival work to try to understand the policies and how they actually work, right? So going through, thinking about that. But then we did a lot of surveys and had secondary data as well to look at, like, their behavior, basically.
What would be secondary data?
So we have data on sort of cropping patterns. So that was more the alfalfa, less the dairy. But yeah, so we have, often I'll use for these kinds of questions remotely sensed imagery to think about, what's happening with land use. Or ag census data we used to look at. Yeah.
When you approach these problems, do you have a theory in mind? I'm interested in your working process. You say, okay, well, we really want to understand how water institutions are affecting farmers' behaviors. Do you have certain theories, or do you take the IAD framework and you say, okay, let's try to understand this problem from the IAD framework, and then we get an answer, and it's sort of, I wouldn't say it's theoretical, but it's framework driven to try to understand the mechanisms?
I would say,
how do you
I think about it sort of like iterative. Like, I'll start out with the framework usually, and frequently, even if I'm not explicitly using it, it's so internal to my being that I'm using it, and I don't even realize I'm like, oh, I need this and this and this and this, right? But yeah, I don't want to say I'm atheoretical, but I will say that I'm willing to borrow from lots of different theories, and so I have the ones that I was fairly well trained in, the sort of new institutional ideas. So I'm looking at incentives and constraints on human behavior. But increasingly, when I work with other people that have other theories that they're drawing from, I'm willing to think about, like, oh, how would that affect decision making? But usually, I'll still go back to like that. I have a tendency to prioritize the individual, so thinking about their behavior. But I don't want to say I'm atheoretical, but I'm open-minded in my yeah.
I'm not sure how much your work actually gets at this, so maybe the answer to this is that you don't know. But I'm curious if you have a sense from some of this work about where and how new information comes into this, and how that is like affecting
Right.
the decisions people are making, and sort of what types, what
Right.
level.
Right. Okay, so the fracking one is like that's one of the ones where we're explicitly trying to do that, but we haven't done it yet. But the idea is the survey, which we have, we're still designing, but we're going to have a series of questions. Basically, it's like, where did you get that policy idea? And then we're going to go to those people, and so it's this. We're going to build this network of like where the information flows about these different kinds of policies coming from. The more qualitative work, though, like we reconstructed networks, although it was an explicit network study for the collaborative adaptive management in southern Arizona, and we asked them where they were getting ideas, and so we have more qualitative understanding of, a lot of the ideas were coming. So, the Malpai borrowed from some other collaborative groups, and then once they were established, they were really influential in that area, and then likewise, the Upper San Pedro Partnership was borrowing ideas from some other watershed groups. And once they were established, they influenced a lot of what was going on. And so it's more qualitative. Like, we don't have, these flows and how much weights and all that sort of things, but we have information about how and where things were coming from. As well as, almost in an experimental way with the Agua Fria, which is the one where we were brought in and helped kind of facilitate there. We were sort of seeing what was ongoing, and we do have in our transcripts like them talking about, oh, well, so and so blah blah blah, they're doing this, we should think about that. And so we have that in transcripts, although we haven't coded. Yeah. Yeah, although sometimes you'll find that person that brought it in, right? But yeah, we haven't done any. Although, okay, so one thing I didn't. So this Chitlin work is a CNH, and one of the parts is a coupled natural human system funded project, and we have an invasive species expert that is a part of our team, and so we're doing these experiments there where they're doing treatments, and we have 6 villages we're working in, and we're paying them to do these kind of treatments. Then once we figure out which treatments work, we will be doing basically an experiment, like we're giving information, right? So we'll see how that, we could test some things, but that wasn't a huge part of the design. But I do think that's really important, right? Like, if you have new ideas coming in, how does that affect what's going on? Yeah. Mhm.
Clearly, as you're working and borrowing and as you're playing off of each other, what do you find is important for how teams work well or don't work well?
Mhm. Well, I think, okay, although like the conceptual frameworks we can be angry about or like frustrated with or whatever, but I do think successful teams revisit that over my experiences. At the beginning, you have to sort of establish how are you talking about things. You have to do some translation and learning about the other discipline to understand what they're talking about. But then throughout the time, you revisit that and think about it. So the Chitwan project now, so what is our fifth year, fourth year? So we've been doing that. So every year we kind of explicitly revisit, and I think that's helped a lot. And even if it's not formalized in other groups, we do that. We like over and over come back to, okay, how are we talking and thinking about these things and check in. On a more practical side, I think some of what has already come up, like working together in these interdisciplinary groups, you bring your institutions, right? All of your baggage from your discipline and ways of working that are different. So we spend a lot of time also on like authorship rules and things like that. And again, in those meetings, you're like, oh my God, I cannot spend an hour talking about like my ethical perspectives on authorship. But on the other hand, if you don't do that work, you're pissed, right? When other people violate whatever norm you have from your discipline that you should or shouldn't be on a paper, oh gosh, like in academia, like those are our big things, right? We don't make a ton of money, but it's our little name on the stuff. So that's really important to pay attention to those things of like, how do you work together? Who has rights to data? Who should be on a paper? Who gets to bring new people in? Like when you're working these big, it's these interpersonal things I think that are really important. And sometimes those are hard conversations, but if you don't have them, those things fester and fester and fester. And I've been a part of teams that have failed, and a lot of times it's a little miscommunication at the beginning that just gets worse and worse and worse and worse.
Chris brought up this morning about this idea of, and others did in other groups, the idea of the sum is greater than the parts.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that, and also this notion of perhaps one joins a team so that one part can be bigger.
Right.
Maybe you could reflect a little bit about that.
Yeah, you'll notice if you look at my CV, I have no single authored pieces. And I'm tenured, yes. And I'm a social scientist, right? I mean, in some disciplines that's common, and in ours, I would say it's increasingly more common, but it's still, I'm a part of like the big teams. Like often my papers have 10, 12, 15 co-authors, which is more unusual in social sciences. And I've just never, I've always felt like it was the bigger team science things were more interesting. And sure, I could carve off and do some little thing, but I'm just not interested in that. And so I remember, so I have a really good friend who's very successful, and we have different paths, but she's very strategic. She thinks about like, how am I going to, she's full and she's whatever, all quicker than, yes, she's very good at that. I'm not that person. And I remember early on, Lynn was sort of mentoring both of us at ASU, and I was talking with Lynn about it. She's like, don't worry about that. Like, just do good science, do what's exciting to you. Keep working hard. Like, don't worry about strategizing in this, you need to be in this journal or that journal or whatever. If you do good work, ultimately you'll be fine. And I don't know if that's exactly right, but for me it was right. Like, sure, maybe it took me a little longer to get here, to get there, but I'm here for the long haul, and I want to be excited about what I do. And so I follow her. I mean, it worked out for her, right?
Thank you. Oh.
Yeah, no, just on that point, I think it's interesting because I'm part of the same,
Yeah.
member of the same generation.
Right.
And I completely agree with you. But I wonder if that's not sufficient anymore.
It might be.
It's more of a necessary but not sufficient. It's necessary to be in love with what you do and
right.
do what you're passionate about, but increasingly I think it is less and less sufficient to
I would say,
that
right. Well, I do think, I mean, the strategic part, I would say that you, like, for, when I was on the market, like 5 articles was fine. That's not fine anymore. Like, you need a lot more than that. Or maybe if they're like science or something, fine. But, like, what you need in your CV, it varies across discipline, but it's more and more and more and more. And so that is true. That is different. So, I mean, I don't think that, yeah. But I also don't think you should only become a strategic player because I think you'll get burnt out. But yeah, it's true. We shouldn't all have like rose-colored glasses. It's a competitive world out there, and it's increasingly hard. Yeah.
Well, I thought we were going to end up on an optimistic note, but now we're on a